all plants don't like us and we should avoid plants. That would be a carnivore diet. That's taken to extreme. Plants in general don't want to be eaten. They were here first. They had it really good before animals arrived because nobody wanted to eat them. They use biologic and chemical warfare to dissuade their predator from eating them or their babies, their seeds.
Welcome to ICOFA podcast. I have a very, very important guest with me, Dr. Stephen Gundry. I'm so honored to have him on my podcast. I'm very confused with his ideology, so I'm going to get a chance to ask him how he's guiding his patients, and also he will guide me. But Dr. Gundry, it would be best probably you explain your background, because it's so like we are a podcaster. You have multiple books, which became a New York Times bestseller. You have your whole system, and you were a very, very famous heart surgeon. So there's a lot in this equation. So welcome to my podcast. And, you're going to be very helpful to Turkish people. One of the reasons that I'm very excited, because most things that you suggest people not to do, it's actually in our Mediterranean and especially Turkish food regimen. So I'm sure you have a way to guide me and us how to continue eating our way without getting the enemies in our gut bacteria. Welcome again.
Well, thank you. Part of the Mediterranean diet, and certainly the Middle Eastern diet, is based on grains and beans. And these are used by many cultures around the world. In fact, many people argue that we wouldn't have modern civilization without the introduction of grains and beans into our diet. But one of the things we forget to realize is that grains and beans in particular have only been introduced into the human diet since about 12,000 years ago. And no human that we can tell ate grains or beans before that time. And I started getting interested in this actually as an undergraduate at Yale University. And I had a special major in human biologic evolution, of how you basically take a great ape and manipulate its food supply and manipulate its environment and arrive at a human being. I wrote a thesis on it and got an honors, and then gave it to my parents and became a famous heart surgeon. But one of the things interesting is that up until agriculture, humans were about 6 feet tall. 2,000 years into agriculture, human beings shrunk about a foot. And that's pretty impressive in such a short time. And so one of the things that was compelling to me when I re-embarked in nutritional studies was the fact that modern agriculture and our modern foods are, in fact, incredibly modern in the human diet. We came from a line of great apes, and we were, quite frankly, mostly plant eaters, and then we became actually fish and shellfish eaters. Anyhow, so I was a very famous heart surgeon and was famous for operating on people that nobody else wanted to operate on, and there are a few of us idiots around the world that do that. And about 26 years ago now, I was referred a patient who I call Big Ed in all my books, who had inoperable coronary artery disease. Now, what that means is you couldn't put stents in because everything was clogged up. You couldn't do bypasses beyond a blockage because where you would land a bypass was clogged up. And this was a young man. He was 48 years old. And he would go around the United States looking for people like myself to operate on him. He spent about 6 months going to centers looking for people, and everybody turned him down. And he would carry around his cardiac catheterization, his angiogram of his coronary arteries. And everybody looked at it and said, "No, can't help you." So he arrived in my office in Loma Linda, California, outside of Los Angeles. And showed me his angiogram, and I said, I have to agree with everybody else. There's nothing I can do for you. And he said, well, yeah, that's what everybody has told me, but let me tell you what I've been doing for the last 6 months. I've been on a diet, and I've actually lost 45 pounds. Now, this is a guy who weighed 265 pounds when I met him, hence the name Big Ed. And he says, I also went to a health food store, and I've been taking a lot of supplements. And he literally brings in a big shopping bag full of supplements. And he goes, maybe I did something in here. And, I go, well, good for you for losing weight, but that's not going to help this. And I know what you did with all those supplements. You made expensive urine, which is what I really believed back then. You wasted all your money. So he said, well, look, I've come all the way from the East Coast of the United States. What would it hurt to get another cardiac catheterization to see? I rolled my eyes and said, well, don't get your hopes up, but yeah, okay. So we get a new angiogram of his heart, and in 6 months' time, this guy has cleaned out 50% of the blockages in his coronary arteries. They're now dissolved. And I, quite frankly, had never seen anything like that. Now, as a surgeon, I was actually very excited because now he still had blockages in his heart, but now there were places that were cleaned out that I could do a bypass to. So I actually did a 5-vessel bypass on him. But afterwards, I was so intrigued. I said, tell me about, this diet that you've been on, and let me look at your supplements. So he starts describing the diet, and I go, wait a minute. That's actually my thesis of what ancient man ate.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And I go, son of a gun. And I go, let me look in your supplements. So I was very famous for devising ways to protect the heart from damage during heart surgery and during transplantation. And I had this mixture of chemicals that I would put into the blood vessels of the heart.
So how many years ago is this approximately?
This was in the mid 1990s. So almost 30 years ago now. Long ago.
So no functional medicine back then, no regenerative medicine back then.
Nothing like that. No. So when I started looking at his chemicals, many of these things that he was swallowing, I was using to protect the heart from damage. And it never occurred to me to swallow them. So why I was so interested was even though I was a very famous heart surgeon, I was very overweight. I was running 30 miles a week. I was going to the gym 1 hour every day. I was eating a healthy, low-fat diet. And I was fat. I had such bad arthritis in my knees. I wore braces. I got migraine headaches when I did heart surgery. And I was told that this was just genetic because my father was the same way. So when all this started, I called my parents and say, do you still have my thesis from Yale University? And they said, oh, yes. Send it up to me. So I put myself on my thesis. I lost 50 pounds my first year. And I started taking these supplements that I was putting down the blood vessels of the heart. And my arthritis went away, my high cholesterol went away, my prediabetes went away, my migraines went away. So I started putting the patients that I operated on at Loma Linda on this program after I operated on them. Because quite frankly, you can do bypass surgery and 5 to 7 years later, the patients will be back and they'll need more bypasses or they'll need stents. And the whole idea in cardiology was this was inevitable, but maybe we could slow it down. So when I put my patients on this program, their diabetes went away, their high blood pressure went away, their arthritis went away. And after about a year of doing this at Loma Linda, I had a really bad decision And I decided that I shouldn't operate on people and then teach them how to eat to stay away from me. I should teach them how to eat first, and then I would never have to operate on them. Now, for a heart surgeon, that's a very bad career choice, as my wife would remind me for many, many years. So I actually, at the height of my career, resigned my position as professor and chairman of cardiothoracic surgery and set up a clinic in Palm Springs, California, which is right next door to Loma Linda. And basically asked people, here, I want you to eat certain foods. I want you to avoid certain foods. I want you to go to a health food store and buy some supplements. And every 3 months, I want to do blood work on you. And let's see what happens. And that was the start of all that.
You live in the heart of one of the blue zones in the world,
Correct.
Loma Linda.
Correct.
So you also have a chance to firsthand analyze what's up with them. Not many people who talks about them like really knows them like you do. You also have very progressive and somewhat contradictory approaches to food, actually. So, and food is one of my things, Dr. Gundry, is that it's really difficult for me to figure out what to eat, what not to eat, what makes me feel good, what is not. And especially with this microbiome science, it's really, really difficult. You know, I listen to many podcasts of yours, and, you know, maybe even you tried some ketogenic diet yourself. What I saw after I turned 51 with menopause, I wasn't able to lose these couple of kilos, and I suddenly get cellulites and stuff, and I was losing my mind. I said, I don't know what to do with this. Up until then, I was eating a lot of vegetables, and it was working fine for me, because when I was eating too much protein, it would turn into muscles very much so I didn't like myself bulky. When I started doing keto diet, actually, I really liked it. And after that, I started eating a lot of protein. It's not like fat heavy, but protein heavy. I feel good. I feel full. But when I did a microbiota test last December, I don't have a leaky gut, yet it shows that I'm not able to digest fat nor protein the way it should. So then I listened to your suggestions, like, it is like I'm in recovery myself for 18 years from drugs and alcohol. I have to limit a part of my life regardless of anything that I would do for longevity. When there's this food thing, and especially so many, I don't want to say even restrictions, but like so many things that shouldn't be eaten, and you are left with so little, and if you don't like, your taste buds are not very much in favor with them, it's really confusing. So let's start with these lectin phenomena, because that's your number one go-to, do not do that.
Sure. Plants in general don't want to be eaten. They were here first. They had it really good before animals arrived because nobody wanted to eat them. And when animals arrived, and insects were the first plant predator, they had a problem that they couldn't run, they couldn't hide, they couldn't fight, but they're chemists of incredible ability. They can turn sunlight into matter, and we haven't figured out how to do that yet. So they use biologic and chemical warfare to dissuade their predator from eating them, or their babies, their seeds. And what's interesting is that part of the defense mechanism are these proteins that are called lectins. Now, there are plenty of other defense mechanisms. Another protein, oxalates, or just another one. But lectins are fascinating in that lectins are designed to seek out sugar molecules, specific sugar molecules that line the wall of our gut, that line the wall of our blood vessels, that line our joint surfaces, that line our blood-brain barrier. And lectins, this has all been actually very well worked out by an Italian who's now a professor at Harvard by the name of Alessio Fasano. And Dr. Fasano discovered the mechanism of how lectins, and for instance, gluten happens to be a lectin.
Mm-hmm.
And he discovered the mechanism of how gluten can bind to these sugar molecules on the wall of the gut and cause leaky gut. And I've expanded on that, on how certain lectins in wheat, like wheat germ agglutinin, can bind to the wall of our blood vessels and produce atherosclerosis. And it can bind to the wall of our blood-brain barrier and create leaky brain. And this has all been, quite frankly, well worked out. Now, the big question is, how come this really never happened to most societies? Why isn't this such a problem? And that gets into what I've been writing about the last few books. Normally, we would have a robust microbiome that loves to eat lectins. Believe it or not, there are bacteria that think gluten is delicious. There are bacteria that love to eat oxalates. And they're basically the defense system against these plant compounds. And long ago, when we all had an intact microbiome, we had a fantastic defense system against these compounds. So there was a really good balance of power, if you will. Now, what happened approximately 50 years ago is a number of things that I've detailed in The Plant Paradox and Gut Check. First and foremost is the use of broad-spectrum antibiotics. I was actually in medical school when broad-spectrum antibiotics were first introduced in the 1970s. And it was miraculous because before, if somebody came in with an infection, we would have to try to culture the bacteria and then test it against various antibiotics to see which one worked. But when broad-spectrum antibiotics came out, it would kill everything. And it was literally miraculous. And we didn't have to do all those tests. Well, the downside, none of us knew, is that not only did it kill all the bad bugs, but it killed all the good bugs in our microbiome. And so we went from being really great in terms of a diffuse microbiome and a diverse microbiome to basically, burning down the tropical rainforest every time we took antibiotics. The sad thing is, simultaneously, agricultural researchers found that if they gave animals low doses of antibiotics, the animals would grow faster and grow fatter than if they weren't given antibiotics.
Actually, I was researching that a little bit just to understand, because while I was reading your Plant Paradox book, there was a chapter about that, and I just was like, I need to really understand that better. Then I started searching what's happening in Turkey, and basically what you're saying is that, and what I read is, because they were in crowded places, for them not to get sick, they were given low dose antibiotics forever in their lifetime.
Yeah, and that was the original reason, because of all these crowded conditions. But the surprising thing to these agricultural scientists was, not only did it prevent them from getting sick, but it literally made them grow faster and faster. So it became a win-win. Now, the problem is, in the United States, 70% of all the antibiotics manufactured are fed to animals. And those antibiotic residues are in the flesh of these animals. So every time, we beef or chicken or pork or whatever, or even fish, farm-raised fish, we get a dose of antibiotics that kills off our microbiome. So in a way, we're sitting ducks in terms of these plant compounds. The other thing that I think, at least in the United States, we've come to realize is that Roundup, the weed killer, was introduced about 50 years ago, and that's glyphosate. Glyphosate was patented by Monsanto, which is now owned by Bayer, as an antibiotic. It wasn't patented as a weed killer. Now, most of the conventional crops in the United States and Canada are sprayed with Roundup, not because they're GMO, but because it's easier to harvest grains or beans if the plant is dead. And we don't need to go into why that is. I grew up in Nebraska, which is a farm state. Anyhow, so now most crops are sprayed with Roundup to kill them so that you can actually harvest them much easier.
It is sprayed to kill the plant, not kill
Yes.
the insect, not save them from illnesses. Wow, okay, that's a new news.
With modern agriculture, with big agriculture, you can't wait around for a field to become, let's just take a field of corn or a field of wheat, to harvest it. You can't wait around. You have these multi-million-dollar harvesting machines that need to be on a particular field on a particular day. And so to make the process more efficient, you go out several weeks before that harvest and you spray the crop with Roundup to kill the wheat plants, and it desiccates, it dries. And quite frankly, it's far easier and far cheaper to harvest a crop that's dry rather than living and wet. And so now Roundup's still used for GMO products, but Roundup is now mainly used as a desiccant to dry plants for harvest. That's why in the United States, almost all of our wheat has got Roundup, corn has got Roundup, oats has Roundup, barley, soybeans. And so most of our conventional crops are coated with Roundup. Now, so what? Those crops are fed to the animals, and they're put in our food supply as well. So the problem with Roundup is we now know it kills bacteria in our gut. And specifically, it kills bacteria that make the feel-good hormones like tryptophan and serotonin. And one of the interesting things is you can actually watch the rise of depression and anxiety parallel the use of Roundup. And I've talked about that in Gut Check. It's actually really scary. Mm-hmm. So the long story short is we've had a brilliant system that's evolved over, millions of years. And in the course of 50 years, we've decimated this beautiful, symbiotic relationship between our gut microbiome and us. So that's a capsule summary of what went wrong.
So basically, you're suggesting to people not to eat these products because it kills somewhat. It's not because they have a gluten allergy or they have a celiac disease. It's more like any of these, whether it's a beef or barley or corn you eat. So you have a great way to say, like, you eat what you eat. Is that how you say it?
Yeah, that's exactly right. You are what you eat, but you are what the thing you're eating ate.
Yeah, so that's that. So, I had a guest about mold and mycotoxins, and he was talking about actually how these animals are fed with these products. Therefore,
Yeah.
we take in the mold somewhat, even though we're not living in a moldy environment, somewhat we're eating it. So what about these lectins, though? Like, there's like lentil is so popular in Turkey. Chickpeas is definitely very, very beans.
Yeah.
What are we going to do?
I think the easiest way to explain this, I just finished writing my next book, which is the gut brain paradox. And one of the things that is interesting to me is that all of these foods, like a lentil, like a chickpea, actually has its own bacteria microbiome coating each one of these seeds. And traditionally, all cultures soaked their beans or their grains. They fermented their grains. And if anybody soaked a pot of beans like I have, you notice that kind of this foam rises to the top after a few hours. And that foam is actually the fermentation of those beans or those lentils or the chickpeas.
Oh, wow.
And the fermentation is the bacteria eating the lectins that coat these beans. So part of what I do is study how traditional cultures always detoxified these plant compounds. For instance, the Incas ate quinoa, but the Incas actually soaked quinoa for 48 hours. They let it rot. They fermented it, and then they cooked it. And it's not on the package directions. I spent a lot of time in Italy, particularly in Tuscany, which was the very poor part of Italy. And Tuscans always fermented their beans for 48 hours before they would cook them. And you go, well, why would they do that? Why waste the time? Well, they were detoxifying them. They were eliminating or lessening the lectin content.
Is it the same with rice?
Rice, interestingly enough, most of the lectins are on the hull of grains. In Asia, 4 billion people use rice as their staple, and yet 4 billion people eat white rice rather than brown rice. Now you go, how could they be so stupid? Because, all the good stuff is in the brown rice. Well, that's where the lectins are, and they've been removing that for 9,000 years since rice was introduced. They go to the trouble of doing that. Interesting, corn began in Central America, and corn was always treated with lye to take the hull off the corn, and it became what was called hominy. And then that was ground up into a powder that's called masa harina. So you look at all these cultures and you go, look at the steps they did.
In Turkey also, in the cooking, make the rice sit in the water, in a kind of a warmer water for overnight. The beans,
exactly.
the lentils and stuff. Funny enough, that was the old culture. But I think nowadays people are starting to either get lazy about it or just don't care about it, because we have this couple living with us in our south of Turkey, in Bodrum. The woman is an incredible cook, and my brother loves lentils, and we were there as a family. And knowing that I was going to do this program, I said, so did you wet the lentil? And she goes like, no, I just boiled it right away. I said, like, what happened to the old-fashioned cooking? So I see that, with modern world, all these traditional proper cooking, I shall say, not just traditional, started shifting.
Yeah, it's the same way, with bread, with wheat. Fermentation is actually pretty effective at breaking down these compounds. And bread, was always, fermented as a way of raising the bread. But now, that's too much trouble. And we make it rise with rising agents called transglutaminase. So we just lost touch with what all these cultures have figured out how to do.
You said we used to have bacteria fighting with lectins, correct?
Eating them, yeah.
Eating them. Now we don't, or most of us don't.
Most of us don't,
there
correct.
are still people who has it.
Oh, yeah, traditional societies, who aren't exposed to antibiotics.
And that is due to all these, antibiotics and pesticides, etc. So what happens now when we eat a fruit or a vegetable with lectins?
Basically, they now have a straight shot to get to the wall of our gut. Let me give you an example. About 80% of my practice now is people with autoimmune diseases. Every one of these people have leaky gut by blood test, and every one of these people have multiple antibodies to the various components of wheat, to corn, to other lectin-containing foods. And the exciting thing is, and the reason I actually still see patients 6 days a week, I'll see a patient in about 20 minutes starting today, is that we can show, and I've published, that by removing these troublesome foods, at least initially, or treating them in the proper way, the leaky gut heals, and the antibodies to these various lectins actually go away. And 94% of my patients, within a year of starting the program, all their markers for autoimmune disease go away. Just yesterday, I had 2 patients, one with Hashimoto's thyroiditis that after a year no longer has any antithyroid antibodies. And the other one had a very severe case of lupus erythematosus, and now after a year no longer has any antibodies to lupus. And we can actually follow that remission, by looking at their leaky gut. And as their leaky gut seals, intestinal permeability, their autoimmune disease resolves. It's almost miraculous, except you can actually document it.
When I listened to you at the conference in London, you were also talking about another patient who were going to have a knee surgery, I guess. And after your diet, not only he didn't have a pain, he didn't need to have a surgery. So that was like really amazing. My question to you, is there a way to heal the gut in a way that we would have these good bacteria to eat the lectins?
Yeah.
So we don't need to really limit our food intake.
Well, yeah, I think there's 2 brilliant microbiome researchers at Stanford University in California, the Sonnenberg husband and wife team. They're very pessimistic. We're supposed to have a tropical rainforest of bacteria and fungi and molds living in our gut. And with all of these different interdependent species, like a tropical rainforest. And we know that hunter-gatherer societies have an incredible diversity in their microbiome, thousands and thousands of different species. And they all, interact. The Sonnenbergs have shown that, and again, we'll talk Americans because we're the worst, or the English or Canadians. We have such a decimated microbiome. It's literally like this tropical rainforest is now a desert with very few species. They're very pessimistic that we can ever restore this diversity. I'm less pessimistic about that. And the reason I'm less pessimistic is we know that there are keystone species that I write about in Gut Check that are very important to if you will, encourage the growth of other species. And most of these bacteria, up until a few years ago, we couldn't grow in the laboratory. We couldn't make them into a probiotic that we could swallow. But with each passing year, people are growing these bacteria and proving that these bacteria can be encouraged to grow in us, and proving that they will foster the growth of other bacteria. So I think it's just a matter of time that we will be able to get a diverse tropical rainforest. Now, what's sad is, just like in California, we obviously have wildfires. I lost one of our houses to a wildfire a few years ago. Let's suppose that forest burns to the ground and we go out and plant all these seedlings. Obviously, it's going to take 20 or 30 years for those seedlings to, grow a forest again. And I think we've been a little naive that, let's suppose we take some antibiotics for a bladder infection, and it will kill off our microbiome. And you can look at people with one single dose of antibiotics, their gut microbiome may only have 2 or 3 species 2 years later when it should have 10,000 species. So it's going to take a while to rebuild this forest. And when I first started this 25 years ago, I was pretty naive and I thought I could cure leaky gut in a couple of weeks. Most of the time, a year is about the right time, but some people can take 2 years, 3 years. One young man recently, we started 4 years ago. He had severe fibromyalgia, couldn't even leave the house. It's taken us 4 years. But now his leaky gut is gone, his intestinal diversity is fantastic, and he has no more fibromyalgia. Do I think he cheated more than he should have? Yeah, but he's happy, I'm happy, and I learned from him. So that's why I keep seeing people.
What's your guidance to people about the protein intake? Because it seems like you're not... What should be somebody's diet? Let me ask it this way. Probably it would be better.
Well, I jokingly tell some of my more obese patients that they should be a gorilla who lives in Italy. And by that, I mean they should be eating lots of leaves and pour olive oil on them. And I jokingly say that, but one of my famous statements is the only purpose of food is to get olive oil into your mouth. Interestingly, several of the blue zones use a liter of olive oil per week in their diet. And that's a lot.
That's a lot, yeah.
My wife and I go through about a half a liter a week of olive oil, and that's a lot of olive oil. Anyhow, so I am not a big fan of excess protein. One of the things we have to realize is that most of the protein we eat does not become muscle. Only about 13% of ingested protein actually becomes muscle or bone or tissue. 87% of it is turned into sugar. Now, why?
Why? Yeah, why? Really, why?
Well, we burn sugar. We burn glucose as our preferred fuel for making energy. And there's nothing wrong with that. But we have no storage system for protein. And we do not waste calories ordinarily. So we convert protein into sugar so that we can either burn it for making ATP or we can store it as fat. And that's our storage system. So we really don't have a very high need for protein. Now, both Dr. Walter Longo from USC and I agree with this, and we're, I guess, a bit of an outliers. But we see that protein in general is one of the stimulators of aging. Now, having said all that, in my new book, The Gut-Brain Paradox, I do see patients who do very, very poorly initially on a plant-heavy diet. And jokingly, when the plant paradox first came out, people have told me that I'm the father of the carnivore diet. Because if plants don't like us, then all plants don't like us, and we should avoid plants. And that would be a carnivore diet. That's taken to extreme. But I see a number of patients, and interestingly, a number of patients with addictive personalities or addictions who do extremely well on my modified carnivore diet, which is primarily fish and chicken and fermented beef and pork. And I've been very impressed that sometimes we have to use that, and I do in my practice.
What do you think then about this whole 1 gram to 1 pound of protein intake? What people suggest, many people actually, from people that I do speak with them separately on a private occasions to listening to podcasts at the conferences, there's this push to eat a lot of protein.
Number one, if you're trying to build muscle, if you're, working out and really trying to build muscle, sure, nothing wrong with that. I think the other mistake we've made is that, again, getting back to just a few years ago, there was no such thing as a protein powder. To get protein, we had to eat whole foods. And we've made the mistake with protein like we've made with carbohydrates. We used to eat whole foods and we ate them whole. And so how we broke down protein was a very, very slow digestive process. Now that protein is pre-digested and it's instantly absorbed. And I've written a whole book about it, Unlocking the Keto Code, that it goes slamming into our mitochondria and actually slows down energy production, like rush hour in Los Angeles. If you're going to eat protein, then we should eat it the way we were designed to eat it, and that was as a whole source of protein. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. So, Dr. Gundry, what you're suggesting is that, number one, if you have a leaky gut or any type of an autoimmune disorder, which probably is due to the leaky gut, you first need to heal that. And then after, you would be able to introduce these, whether vegetables or meat or fish, based on how it should be cooked. Not like, oh, I'm healed now, let me just boil the lentil and eat, or just eat any cow meat. You have to be specifically choosing the products that you're eating. And also, I think peeling the vegetables, correct? Even though you're not a fan of tomato.
Well, I love tomatoes, but as long as you peel and de-seed them. In fact, the Italians did not eat tomatoes for 200 years after their native son Columbus brought them back because they were thought to be so deadly. In Italy, you do not make tomato sauce without peeling and de-seeding the tomatoes because the lectins are primarily in the peel and the seeds.
So basically, it's not that scary. Now I feel much more comfortable. So if you follow the suggestions that it's going to be Actually, I think Turkish cuisine is very, we peel the tomato. We never...
I know you do. In fact, I was having a salad in Istanbul a few years ago at lunch. And the tomatoes were peeled and de-seeded, and the cucumbers were peeled and de-seeded. And I went, wow, are these Turkish people so smart? Well, that's because that's how these cultures figured out how you could eat these things. I mean, it's just fascinating.
Exactly. Dr. Gundry, thank you so much. How people can follow you, where would they find you if they want to? I know you have many books. I don't know if they have it in Turkish.
I know the plant paradox has been translated into Turkish. I mean, you can find me on my YouTube channel, on Instagram at drgundry.com, at gundrymd.com, and sometimes hopefully I appear on whatever site you're seeking. I'll pop up and wave. So
Thank you so much for your time, and I'm looking to see you maybe at another conference
yeah, I hope so.
in the near future.
Very good. Great to see you.
Thank you.
Thanks.